Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Um, my job is the easy one, is to introduce our guest. And the guest doesn't need introduction because I think almost every colleague, all the colleagues know Prof. Sina. Prof. Sina? Supposed to read. You had a bio, but they said I mustn't read it. So yeah. Thank you, Prof.
Thank you. Firstly, it's really great to be here, and I think certainly being here this afternoon and seeing and engaging with most of you is, I think we might have to mute it. Can I do it here? No, if I mute it, oh, I need to change, it's this mute.
Well, you can actually mute it.
I think it was my headphones.
Oh.
Yeah. So yeah, if I mute it, the people there may not be able to hear. That was the shortcut. That would be the. So yeah, firstly, just wanted to say thank you and thanks, Professor Bokoro. When I was coming over, I needed some good excuses to see just not my own PhD students, but to see all of you, and I thought that might be a good way. But it also once again engaged, inspired me to do a little bit more, and so I put together a presentation on strategic partnering and impact. And I also thought that the avenue of IEEE, something that I've benefited quite a bit from, is an avenue that some of you, you may have certain takeaways that might be empowering in your own journeys. I do want to recognize that quite a few of you are coming from other disciplines like mechanical engineering or civil engineering, and you may have your own parallel analogies that you can build. I also want to recognize that a number of you are here, you're quite experienced in this topic, and so I'm sure you may have some ideas and thoughts that can help me in taking some of this thinking forward. I was mentioning just earlier that as I was speaking with people here, and people some are working on their masters and their PhDs, and quite a few people have completed. And so I felt really, really good about that. And so that's really quite encouraging. So back on the strategic partnering and impact. So this is something that the University of Johannesburg did a lot does a lot, not did, does a lot at an institutional level. And I'm seeing Professor Vabu Paul here and a number of you, Professor Pretorius with ESCOM, Professor Paul with a number of organizations, Nikki, TC Gen. So there's actually a lot of expertise on strategic partnering in this room. But I also want to recognize that there may be others who may have not, because of time and because life is often very busy, that in the busyness of life, sometimes the business of strategic partnering does not always come together. Not because you don't know, but just because you're busy. The university, especially during the COVID-19 period, did extensive strategic partnering. And it happened because the university's journey on the fourth industrial revolution had come before COVID. And that meant that it was well activated when it came to the aspects of digital transformation. And COVID came along, and while, of course, there are all the health and social implications that come with COVID, but also came along the greatest impetus to digital transformation worldwide. And the university's strategy and that digital transformation coming together really meant that companies, government, that was keen on partnering would often find the University of Johannesburg as a key player. That meant that the external revenue started to increase relative to 4IR. And a lot of that was at institutional level. What you can't do anything institutionally if you don't have individuals that are involved. Behind every strategic partnering, there are people, including some who are in this room, who were the key enablers in each of these partnering arrangements. So I thought that is a very well-known recipe that the university has used, and I thought maybe to talk about that experience, but then tilting it towards the IEEE, which is the Institute of Electrical and Electronic Engineers. Now, I'm saying some of this, and I know that the electrical folks are quite familiar, but if you may be coming from other areas, I know Rutsina is coming from a social science background, and so in terms of what the rationale is on strategic partnering is often a means, and ultimately it is impact, which is the end goal. And I must say, when I had formulated the topic, I was thinking strategic partnering more as a means and an implementation. But Precious Maputle, who I haven't seen so far, she wrote back in one of her ads and she said, well, I'm looking forward to strategic partnering and impact. And I said, goodness, the audience has higher expectations, so let me quickly change. And that's actually how the first slide changed. If you see her, tell her that that's what happened. So the long-term aspects is for obviously the research group, for research chairs, for the university's impact. But some of you are in different stages, and you may be in a stage where you have to solicit external examiners. You may be in a stage where you're applying for an NRF rating, and you will need like 10 referees. Have some of you come across that in your experiences, especially if you're applying for rating for the first time? And you may actually notice that it's actually not always very easy to find those people, because you have often worked with people not always realizing that you might need someone more independent to become a referee at some point. So the idea of the strategic partnering is not only at organizational level, but it could also be from an individual perspective, and it could be by means of clustering. It could be for fundraising, it could be a short or a medium term goal. It could be for celebrations, 20th year this year at the university. And I also put down a couple of other parameters here that is borrowed from the text by Chris Brink, who was the UJ alumni and also served as Vice Chancellor at Newcastle and Stellenbosch. And Chris Brink had asked a question, which was that if you ask people in a room like this, what is the university good at? You will get several answers. Professor Singh, you might say in nanoelectronics. Dr. Agra, you might talk about planning. And you may have different responses based on your disciplines. But if you change the question, and the first question about being good at is a question of excellence, which is based sometimes on publications and things like that. But if you change the question to say, what are we good for? Slight change to the question, and you say, what are we good for? And then you move towards the question of impact. And then actually it becomes more difficult to answer the same question, because in a room like this, you will find that the isolation of disciplines may not necessarily be what happens when it comes to good for. Societal impact is often a threading between multiple and different disciplines. So even in that journey to attain that impact, the question of strategic partnering comes about. So a practical example might be that if the University of Johannesburg is doing quite well in SDG, say, goal number 1, and the university does very well in that particular goal. Now, one could look at which are the other institutions that are doing well in that particular SDG, and you could partner with them, because that can help the university retain its position. Secondly, there may be other SDGs where we are maybe not doing as well, and you could partner with institutions that are doing quite well, because that will then become an enabler to those areas. So that's the kind of thinking that it is about the complementary but also to retain. And that's something we sometimes, when you're doing very well, you forget that staying there is also an issue. Going just to the engineering faculty, every presentation must have some ads, commercial breaks. So this is the commercial break slide. This is at the University of Canterbury. As you know, I moved there about 2 years almost. It's an old university, 150 years was the celebration 2 years ago. And the engineering faculty did not have a strategy. The institution had a strategy which was initiated in 2018. It's not uncommon, by the way, for many old universities to not have strategies, and that's because they've often felt that they don't need one. By the way, universities need a strategy. One may not always realize that universities in South Africa are often and generally in an upward trajectory, and it may not always feel that way. But if you look at the situation of universities in Canada, the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, New Zealand even, they're all dealing with different population dynamics. So you do definitely need a strategy. So in this particular case, I took the route of sort of a bottom-up, top-down, inside-out strategy build, because that was actually the lesson I learned from here, from you guys. And that also followed incidentally, the African proverb that if you want to go fast, go alone. And if you want to go far, go together. Christchurch, where the University of Canterbury is a small city with 350,000 people. You have to be very careful because everybody knows each other, have to be at good behavior all the time. But in a small setup like that, it also is a benefit if you can interconnect when you're building the strategy. The strategy is just an excuse to build and deepen the connections with the city. By the way, that was also an approach that the city of Johannesburg and actually the engineering faculty did in a very prominent way, where the research chair was formulated between the city and the university. And that happens along the line that if one identifies that infrastructure is an issue, do you solve the problem of infrastructure by changing the maintenance of the whole city? Yes, that will be a great quest if we can achieve that, but it's often very expensive. Or do you complement that with other solutions? For example, I'm saying Professor Makata, the teams that did work on nanotechnology, where you have, if you were in rural parts of the country, you may remember that there was a time where you have tap water flowing from a tap, and there would be a filter, which would be a cloth to remove the sediments. And then you would boil the water to get rid of the chemical waste. And that then converts into a nanotechnology solution where you have to bring down the cost of that nanofilter. So you could get the city's infrastructure fixed on the one end, and on the other end, you have a solution as simple as that. If you can get it cost effective, then you have a complementary of those solutions. Anyway, I'm giving this example because once you have that technology, in this case of around water, you can go back to the city and say, there's an opportunity for a strategic partner by defining a research and innovation chair in the area of sustainable water. The same could be applied in different disciplines in which you may be working on, except that you might be noticing that we are moving the approach to impacting society at large, which works quite nicely with the new strategy of the university, which has that focus, including on sustainability. Anyway, so this was kind of the idea around this particular strategy formulation, but it was very quickly and at the outset recognized that the institution won't be able to deliver on its strategy unless it identifies which partners to synergize with so that the outcome of that or the impact of that is greater. The University of Johannesburg, I already gave the examples earlier on that when the catalytic initiative was formulated, council at the time gave a very tough goal. It said for every rand that would go from council, you have to generate the other rand. And I know people like Professor Paul was working tirelessly because his institute was actually funded through the GES initiative. And I think you exceeded. I think that the demand was 1-to-1. And actually, I think in the end, the Institute for Intelligent Systems generated almost 3 times um, due to the strategic partnering that it developed. And of course, you probably don't always say it, but there was the impetus also of the digital transformation which COVID brought about. So I'm going to be moving to the IEEE mapping. There are a couple of slides, and I know that this is an afternoon and there are public holidays this week as well. So I'm going to summarize the rest of it, and then I'll go into the details. But I'll give you the takeaway now, just in the unlikely event that the detail gets lost. So essentially, what the objective is that the IEEE, which is an org of 430,000 members around the world, with the majority no longer in the United States. The majority is actually outside of the United States. The United States typically has 200,000 members. It's present in 191 countries, including South Africa, initiated in South Africa in 1979. South Africa is one of the older sections of IEEE. It works a little bit like a federation. And in the federation model, there are different technical societies. And these may range from circuits and systems to signal processing to nanotechnology to intelligent transportation to communication society, computer society, and probably every discipline that is present here. Now, once one sees what the structure is, and internal to the university, there would be research groups. The idea is to find the matches, basically. And once the match is found, each of the linkages has an array of benefits that can come about. So that's really at a very high level. I'm going to re-say that, but by way of an example, so it brings the point home. So let's say that Professor Bokoro works in the area of power and energy. And in South Africa, there is presence of a power and energy society. South Africa has got quite a bit of capability in this area, and I know coal has its pluses and minuses, but there's a lot of learning that has been developed because of that capability that exists here. Now, I'm not going to go into the green. I'm just giving, that as an instance which exists there. And if you then take that, the way that power stations were designed, people who have been involved on those design approaches could actually be nominated as a distinguished speaker for IEEE, which means that a learning in South Africa then goes global. And there are many instances in my own area of microelectronics. The work that was done earlier in South Africa, by a company called South African SAMIS, South African Microelectronics Systems, that particular company, which is no longer in place, but was using old technology, to deliver the best products without having to use the best, most expensive prices. So there was a lot of innovation that was bridging those solutions, and certainly people that were involved in that capability development would be individuals who could be nominated as distinguished speakers. So that's one track. The other tracks that are there are that the best journals in electrical engineering are resident within IEEE. So if you want to propose a special issue, I heard Sam Kubani talk about a center in electric vehicles. And if you want to elevate its status very quickly, an approach would be to define a special issue with the open access journal in intelligent transportation system or in vehicular technology, which is one of the societies. So immediately you would start with a base of collating people, the best people in the world, to start writing with people here. And that then builds a unique, and you elevate very quickly. And now you can project this in different disciplines that might exist in different areas. So I'm now going to go into some of the detail with a question in the beginning. For those of you that do know IEEE or don't know IEEE, any idea of a major invention, 1884? I may have given a clue earlier. It's got something to do with load shedding. Right, so electricity was a major invention in 1884, and an exhibition was going to be set up in Philadelphia, and that was actually how IEEE came to being. And then it grew over time. Now, what was also interesting was that journey was of the second industrial revolution. And a university that capitalized quite a bit on that. Big famous university around the world. Any ideas which one? Professor Mashal, good afternoon. Any ideas which university was big university, world number one? MIT. MIT started in 1852, and it took on the leverage of a second industrial revolution, right? And that gave it that lift. And guess what happened here with the fourth industrial revolution? So you can see that there were quite a bit of analogies that was taking place. And incidentally, I think Professor Mashal just walked in. You might remember, because you had just come in, I think, at the time where Professor Philip Clay had received the honorary doctorate, who was the former chancellor of MIT. And that was the build that was going on, because there was an analogy that was taking place with MIT's journey into the second industrial revolution and UJ's journey into the fourth industrial revolution. So if you think about that in 1884, and you think about AI now, those are some of the instances. So you can see the partnering then and partnering that I mentioned with Professor Pauls and other teams. So I'll share a little bit of the IEEE journey because I think it's inspirational about the impact that technology brings in. So 1884, electricity. 1912 was another incident that took place. And I see the answer is there. I was removing the animation from the slides. That's why it got killed. But there was a major thing that happened in 1912, which was, the answer is there, so I won't ask it, but it had to do with radio, because the Titanic went down and the radio communication enablement of that actually saved a lot of lives. So the Institute of Radio Engineers started in parallel in 1912, and the American Institute of Electrical Engineers was started in 1884, and they were running in parallel until 1963, where the two organizations merged because they found a strategic partner in each other. One dealing with, as it was called, even in South Africa for many years, heavy current, and the other that dealt with light current. I don't like the light current and the heavy current, because the joke when I moved away from heavy current, Professor Pretorius, was that they do the easy stuff. So, it was quite a controversial move from electrical to electronics for me too. But that's a good example of what strategic, because if it wasn't for strategic partnering, one of the two organizations would no longer exist. So the combination made the difference. Another thing I thought I will mention here is that South Africa plays a very important role in IEEE. The third oldest journal in electrical engineering, which is the South Africa Institute of Electrical Engineers Journal, the Africa Research Journal, that's the third oldest in the world, and it's housed by IEEE Explore. Through a 7-year process, the journal and all its back files was adopted by IEEE. And that is a prominent feature that South Africa makes. And it's quite interesting as the impact factor of the journal increased. And if you look at where the citations are, some of the citations are not only in electrical engineering, but are in history, are in the social sciences, because of the role that engineers were playing in terms of democratization of technology, irrespective of demographics. And that was a feature that appears in many of the journals where this was coming through. There was an economic angle to it too, but that was an instance. So as I mentioned earlier, the membership is distributed largely now outside of the United States. This is kind of the structure. There are three major boards. Now, the Technical Activities Board is where the societies are, so signal processing, communications, and the Educational Activities Board is another entity. These three entities that are highlighted also have funding opportunities. So I'll focus on that. Just to give you an idea, I did mention there were 430,000 members, but it is not through membership that is the biggest revenue of IEEE. The biggest revenue actually is through publications and conferences. And so 1,300 conferences take place every year, and that's actually where, and the sale of IEEE Explore is really where the revenue comes from. But because it is defined as a charity in the United States, that means that all the income has to be redeployed in volunteer activities. So these are the societies that are there. And you don't have to be an electrical engineer to partake in societies of IEEE. In fact, the acronym jovially is said not as Institute for Electrical and Electronic Engineers, but it's often said as, well, jovially, colloquially, as Institute of Engineers and everybody else, because everyone has a touch of technology or is touched by technology. So the IEEE Life Science Initiative has people from the medical sciences, natural sciences, the technology, the journal on the Society on Implications of Technology has people from the social sciences. As often the barrier of technology, barrier or the enabler, if it works in conjunction with society, then it has a lot more meaning, and especially with AI and its advances with ethics, with discrimination, bias, and all of those areas, it actually means that journals of the social implications of technology finds much more prominence. So all of these have key transactions, have proceedings, which are the leading journals in the discipline. And you can really look at all of them. And sometimes one has to be a little strategic. So, for example, I see that Dr. Fanaro has also come in working in the areas of electric vehicles. And it just happens that you're seated next to Professor Sam Kabani, and I had mentioned the two of you earlier. So the EV area, you could find EVs in three areas. You could find them in Communication Society, you could find them in Intelligent Transportation Society, and you could find them in vehicular technology. And the Communication Society is a very busy society with a lot of attention seeking around the world. But intelligent transportation is often an easier one to work with initially, to then find the step to form an alliance with Communication Society. So just by those kind of thinking, of which is it's like where you go, there's bigger competition. It's a bit of thinking around those lines. I just want to get, when you look at the list of the societies here, is there anyone that feels that they're not finding themselves included in one of these areas? Because I could help. Rotina, you have no excuse. Your social implications of technology is there. And that would be systems man and cybernetics would be another one where the social sciences publishers come in. Education is another area where engineering education, for example, and education is all about pedagogy, which has a lot of leverage in the social sciences. So again, you can see that there are quite a few areas. Perhaps, the ALD atomic layer deposition work that you're doing, Professor Jen, would have a nanotechnology link. So in the South Africa setup, we have, at the South Africa section, we have chapters of IEEE that one could immediately affiliate with, if not already affiliated with. That's one way of doing it. You could also, at the university, have and encourage students. So each of the research areas could encourage their students, postgraduate and postdocs. And I know you have a lot of postdocs. UJ is quite known for postdocs. I saw Professor Mpedi's ad the other day of 1,000 postdocs. So that's a great component that builds capability. And that's an area where starting technical chapters within student branch arrangements could be another thing to do. Because when the IEEE looks at technical chapters, it does not kind of discriminate between section and student branch. You can get the resources. So let's say there's a Power and Energy Society chapter within UJ that asks for a funding from the Power Energy Society of IEEE. IEEE will not say that you are a student branch entity or a section entity, doesn't matter. As long as there's a chapter association, the resource connection can be built. I gave in the University of Pretoria has got a good structure, and WITS actually, I'm not so sure about WITS at this moment, but I know University, I've placed that there because that could be a model to work with, and there are people there that are willing to work together. Here is an instance of the EMBS, which is the Medicine and Biology Society, which again, if you're organizing activities and you're looking for matching funding, that's provided by the society. Not big funding, it's small funding often, but for a student branch activity, $1,000 can be something. I'll talk about the big funding as we go on. ITSS, the Transportation Society, Intelligent Transportation Society. So if you're thinking about an EV and you're thinking of that as a new initiative, partnering with ITSS gives you that lift much easier, the publication lift on the one end, and you can put a new initiative proposal of $40,000. So that's an example that can come. These are some of the slides are older, so the dates are, but there would be an initiative that comes up each year. Another example here is the Solid States Circuits Society. Again, there are some events that one can organize, and again, there's matching support. The requirements to form a student chapter is quite easy. So if you don't want, you can work ideally with the national chapter, but if you want to create your own formulation, there's a 6 members or 12 members that's required. I think it's 6 for student branches, and so that's there. Sometimes you can have joint chapters between, say, circuits and systems and solid states society. But that would be, and then you do need an advisor for each of the chapters. So often a research group lead would be the advisor of the, and then from there one can initiate projects. In 2010, prior to 2010, IEEE had a tagline which was networking the world, which was seen as a limiting kind of tagline because networking also has the technical component, and then of course it's got professional networking. So it changed in 2010 to the Advancing Technology for Humanity as the tagline. And that meant that programs and initiatives needed to follow the change in the tagline, else it would be nothing but just an ad. Now that is a tagline that resonates quite strongly, I think, with UJ's strategy when it comes to sustainability and society and impact. So maybe one wants to keep that in mind. And there are a couple of formulations here that also have both societal and financial impact. One area is tri-engineering. So we're often engaging with pre-university groups, and many times they're not aware of what engineering programs are about. I remember when I was here, we would, find ourselves in a term in January where there was some, I don't know if it still exists, but there was a list called the CACH list of the Department of Higher Education. And this was a list where students would apply. Well, no, sorry. These were the list of students who had eligibility based on the admission point score. But guess what? They had not applied for any engineering program or any program for that matter. Often you would find students with very high APS. But guess what was happening? They were coming from schools where they may have been the only person to attain an APS of 36 or 38, whatever. And it was quite unique because you will call them and say, have you applied? And they will tell you that no, because my grandmother is the one that's paying and is looking after me, I don't want to burden her further, so I have not applied. And they would not actually know about NSFAS. And then you would say, can you come along? And then they would say, but what is engineering? And thus these kind of portals, and they're not zero rated, but now times are that people will have some access, even if they don't have the best access in different parts. And it's improving and it'll continue to improve. So that's a portal that does. So then there is an initiative which I think is critical, especially in the societal impact strategic direction, which is called EPICS. It stands for Engineering Programs in Community Service. This program originated in university. It started in the mid-90s. And the Purdue Engineering, and like many engineering programs in the United States, saw a decline of students who took up electrical engineering for multiple years. And they looked for a program that connects engineering with purpose, connects engineering with society. And they created this particular program called EPICS. But it was mainly in the United States. And what was interesting about this program at Purdue was that it brought about some of the minority groups and women who were not traditionally part of engineering programs started to see the purpose orientation of engineering programs and impact at the pre-university level. So, for example, the connection of water and its improvement in quality and sanitation, which is often a delivery of civil engineers, finds health improve of society at large. While it may be obvious to many of us here, it was not always obvious to students at the pre-university. They often thought that connection was with the medical sciences. So that is an initiative where one can apply, anything between $1,000 to $10,000. And the model is simple. You identify with a community a problem that a community faces. You identify it with the community, not to or for a community. And once you have identified the problem, then a non-governmental organization or a non-profit organization partnering with a non-profit organization plus a pre-university is usually a good idea, because then it brings vertical integration and the university together makes a submission. These are examples of some. This is a call in the area of AI, and there was another call in the area of SDGs recently. So calls keep appearing. And I actually think that Professor Rolin, who used to be here, and maybe Nikki, I don't know if you got funding from this. I don't think so. But UJ did have recipient. I happened to meet her in Pittsburgh when I was traveling, and so I'm aware that she had funding from this particular initiative. There's a very good chance, if you apply, that you will get a grant here, because South Africa is often seen as a leader, particularly in the social science spaces. So the connection between society as a platform and engineering, it's a well appreciated angle. Another one is the Humanitarian Technologies Board. It's led, until recently was led by Herbert Luanga from Uganda. And again, funding opportunity, not big again, $25,000 to $50,000 US dollars. See, I have to differentiate between US dollars and New Zealand dollars at the moment. The US dollar is the better one to select. Well, maybe that's a tough statement. In Parliament, they say you can withdraw. So let me withdraw that statement. But this one is the Tech for Good, very good opportunity here. If you take Sustainable Development Goal number 9, industry, infrastructure, innovation, and you look at the problems that a city may face, and we often say, council must fix this, or someone must fix this, we must wait for an election year. Instead, you could say that problem is a solution that awaits a university action, working with the council and applying for funding here. What often happened in projects, I'll give an example of a project of EPICS in Imasitandane in the Western Cape, which dealt with solar solutions for an orphanage because of parents who were HIV positive. And the Imasitandane, the orphanage, then had solar solutions. It was quite an interesting problem for the academic team, as in a township such as that, things and culturally were shared, including electricity. And the solar solution and its limitations then brought about both the social sciences as well as engineering and understanding how to work. IEEE funded that initiative. There were publications that were written from it. It also went to the Global Humanitarian Technology Conference, which is a conference that is held annually. And of course, it's a subsidizable conference. And there's a journal that flows from that, which is in the Societal Implications of Technology. This year's conference will be in Santa Barbara. Another area which has got funding slightly bigger now, between 50 to 100K US dollars, is the IEEE Foundation. Again, this could be, the question of impact often comes about here. So you have to think about the impact first. Often as engineers, we think about a technology area. So the difference is that you have to, at the outset, start thinking about the impact. This strategy is not a bad one to adopt, by the way, because if you were doing NRF applications more recently, you would have noticed that the NRF, all its applications of the NRF, has got the four things. One is transformation. The second part of the NRF strategy is impact. The third one is excellence. And the fourth one is sustainability. So the aspect of impact, if you work with the foundation or any of the other areas and you're building that impact, it connects well with the IEEE story, to the NRF story, to the rating story. And you can see that the set of those stories leading to a legacy. If you don't remember the NRF strategy, just remember this tie and remember them in multiples ties, because that's how we used to remember the strategy: ties, transformation, impact, excellence, and sustainability. That's how the strategy was abbreviated. So keep that in mind, because often when you're looking for rating applications, you arrive there and you look at the requirements only to find yourself stuck. And if you start to think about these levers, they are there to enable the journey of that success. I do want to say the journey of the success because I at least think of 40% of this room here that came in. I remember when I had joined the university in 2013, they told me, if you want to go and see research outputs, go to the Auckland Park, Kingsway campus, right? And as you know, that the Durenfontein campus by far leads in terms of research outputs at the university. So it was quite an interesting shift. So I do know that success is quite guaranteed with the team that is in this room. Women in engineering is another area. This is a controversial area because the shifts that are taking place in the United States with diversity and inclusion. But I have many friends there, is that one does find that countries like South Africa that have quite a lead in this area, well, in the steady state, let's call it that, because in the steady state, there's an economic benefit, not just a social justice cause. So the Women in Engineering program is gaining quite a bit of momentum, continues to. And we do have quite a lot of exemplary examples in the South African setup that exist. So what I have personally found in my own journey, right from, I went through the promotion system at the University of Pretoria, where, by the way, you need to provide 10 referees to go to an AP. It's almost like the NRF rating process. And they have to be independent. And a lot of my linkages, people that I may not have worked directly, actually came from networks within the IEEE. Then, of course, you find NRF rating, and many of you have experienced that, and you will find that those requirements and examiners and all of those things. Going to conferences is another way. I'm not saying it's the only way, but this mechanism does certainly help. What I started to do was something very simple. I like simple things, just like you do, is to take the list of IEEE distinguished lecturers, and they exist in every single area. And I would write to, they are, now it's a bit different because they're application online forms for most of the societies, but I would at the time write an email and say, would you like to come over to South Africa because you haven't been, and we want you to deliver a talk, and IEEE would fund the distinguished lecturer, and they would come over and present a talk. And often the distinguished lecturers were editors-in-chief, associate editors of IEEE journals. A big thing happened in 2010. I know you're thinking of the World Cup. That happened as well. But aside from the World Cup was a conference called ICC 2010, which was hosted in Cape Town. It's got nothing to do with cricket, by the way. It's the International Conference on Communications, which had 4,000 attendees. The conference took place in May, and the World Cup finals was in early July. And it brought lots of distinguished lecturers, and there were events right through. Of course, a lot of folks from Germany too, but they did feature in the World Cup as well. Anyway, so that momentum built, and you will see actually that the Communication Society had quite a rise within IEEE publications because of the network it built. So what was also very interesting for me was because I used to struggle to get funding for chip design, because a little chip like that to prototype is about R1 million. And I used to apply each year to IBM, and consistently they would reject it. I think for 7 years they rejected it. So if you have grant applications rejected, don't feel bad. And then I reached a distinguished lecturer who was within the IBM family, and I said, don't you want to visit the labs here and give a distinguished lecture? And this fellow came through, and he looked at the labs, and he looked at all the things, and he said, gosh, goodness, you guys are doing this type of work here? He just had never imagined it. And so he wrote back to the IBM team, and the story thereafter was a journey of success. And Professor Mashao, a few years ago, you signed one of those application forms which succeeded. So it's been quite interesting when you bring in these people. And of course, when they come through, there are other advantages to the broader country, such as the tourism industry and so on. Which is not always known. People often are sometimes a bit nervous and things, but when they come through, they realize that there's a lot more to it. So in that mix, you also find networking with Europe, which is Europe and the Commonwealth is gaining a lot of prominence. Being in New Zealand, I often get requests between collaboration with South Africa, the UK, Canada. These groups are forming stronger alliances. Cost is one initiative, and I thought I'll mention this. It's a networking initiative, 150,000 euros per year. UJ in particular has been quite successful on European grants. A big example of that is the Intra-Africa Mobility Grant, which Professor Innocent Musonda and his team host. I can't remember exactly the figure, but it was almost 15 million. It was a big amount in rands. Cost is an initiative which is quite a unique initiative. In fact, if you look at the guidelines of the initiative, you see all the European countries listed, and just underneath it, you see South Africa can be a member country, an applicant in the same league, and whereas the others, quite an interesting one. quite underutilized, by the way. And I thought I'll mention it because if you're looking for funding, these are still networking. It's not too big, but 150,000 euros probably will convert to a good amount at the moment. And the nice thing is that once you get a grant like this, you can find matching grants. It's amazing that when you go to someone and say, can you contribute? They say no. But if you have a grant with someone and you say, I've got a grant here and I've got another one here, you will find that their confidence level has changed. And by the way, that was an interesting approach with research chairs at UJ, was we would often say that, someone in Professor Paul's or whichever team works in this specialization. I'm looking at you, Professor Mashinini, titanium, prosthetics, whatever. And that's the capability for which, the university funds you in your research space. And then you go and say to a company, can you contribute scholarships or bursaries to the same tune? Because I am going to dedicate my time doing research in that with that alignment. And then that portion, if it's defined as a scholarship, the company doesn't get an IP benefit, but gets a tax benefit. And the moment you have that mix, guess what you do? You add the two numbers together and you go to a third party. And you build. And the university has many examples like that in the CETA space, where it has built these chairs. And I saw recently an announcement with Bank CETA. So that's been typically the approach. And so very quickly, if you're in this room, you can start thinking about that unique strength you have and then how to build it with the company. Distinguished lectures I talked about, because often and it happens quite a lot when people are in the room and they're like, gosh, this must be someone else from some other country. Actually, South Africans often don't always make a submission. And I think it's worth nominating people as distinguished lecturers and speakers. And there are different series and different levels. There are a couple of awards that also exist. I do think that people here are quite eligible for some of these awards. Major Education Innovation Award. I think that, NSTF has awards locally, and this could be the international edition of a recipient. The award, and of course, IEEE will then fund the award recipients, which also provides a good networking opportunity. So in summary, the opportunities are many with the networking combination with IEEE. Either through affinity groups, EPICs, or humanitarian technology projects or starting technology chapters. And that's really the message I'd like to leave you with. And I have again found this partner of my own my own professional home quite beneficial. And I'm kind of here to encourage those of you that are involved to be more involved, and those of you who are yet to be involved to be involved. I must also declare that I am on the IEEE Foundation board. So if you do make a submission, I'll just recuse myself and I won't worry, because I will say that applications that do come from South Africa are usually very good. You may not be aware of that, but usually are very good, because South Africans are very good at following bureaucracy, follow the rules to the T. And actually, in general, applications that come from here. And so I think that when you do see these calls, do think that that's an area where you can submit an application. And a lot of them are not calls based on deadlines. You can make a submission there on a rolling basis, like EPICS. Although there are calls for specific themes, it does accept applications on a rolling basis as well. So that's really my story. And I just wanted to say once again, thank all of you, both for the presentation. I hope you found some of it useful, but also for this chance to see you. And it's really nice to be here engaging. So I'm going to stop here for questions, comments, advice that